So Shannon, you work very closely with Indigenous entrepreneurs in your consulting with the Finance Cafe. One of the things that Shannon had mentioned was the real need for literacy. And you're a huge proponent for that. You've innovated new funding models also to help achieve economic and social equality. How do you see the current state of Indigenous business from the ecosystem standpoint? And what should founders know and, more importantly, do so that they can achieve their true potential?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question, Barry. Thanks to the panelists and everyone too for taking the time to join us today. And I recognize we've got people across Turtle Island. I do just want to take a moment to mention that I am calling in today from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai. I also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and as well all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region, of Southern Alberta. I think you ask a really big question because there's two parts of this. There's sort of the role of the ecosystem, and then there's what can founders do? And you are right, Barry, that I do work a lot with entrepreneurs. And I think the first thing that we have to just acknowledge too is that we say the word ecosystem, we're still dealing with a system, and a system that wasn't designed for Indigenous entrepreneurs to thrive in the way that it is today. So this past week, actually, I was with colleagues from across the world. We were joined by the National Indigenous Hub for Women's Entrepreneurship and Grand Challenges Canada Indigenous Innovation Initiative. But we had Indigenous women from around the world. We had participants from Australia, from the US, we had participants from Canada as well, to really talk about what does it mean to co-create the conditions for a future of an inclusive innovation ecosystem that is going to address a lot of these colonial impacts, but also that creates this affirming space for Indigenous innovators and entrepreneurs. And I think it's so important to mention that we are in this time of healing, and the work that I'm very much focused on does take a gender lens, because we certainly do see as well that while Indigenous entrepreneurs have to overcome barriers, we also see that for Indigenous women entrepreneurs, these barriers are even greater when it comes to accessing things like financial capital, that social capital that is so important to connecting to networks, to markets, that financial literacy, or just even, I'll say, entrepreneurial capital. And even just in terms of how do I even start a business? And it's sort of reconciling some of these, what today's entrepreneurship environment really looks like, the Western world of entrepreneurship, and trying to reconcile that, I guess, if you will, with Indigenous values and traditional ways of knowing. And so, entrepreneurship itself is a pathway to economic self-sufficiency. And we often hear for entrepreneurs that it is a source of medicine. It is a source of healing. There's a lot that we need to overcome, just even around when we talk about financial literacy, but there's a whole lot of conversation that needs to happen just even around money. It's very hard to even engage with something like financial literacy when we haven't even spoken about money. Money has been it's a power dynamic for Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of trauma that we are just starting to really uncover when it comes to financials. I work with a ton of entrepreneurs, mostly Indigenous women entrepreneurs, and the trauma that comes out around money, knowing how to price ourselves. Some of the concerns about even feeling guilty about making money off of a gift, right? Or a product, or, there's this, we still see lateral violence around people who make money off of the culture, if you will. So as an ecosystem, and getting back into some of the work that we were doing this past week was really to talk about the importance of working together as a collective. And that collective includes government, education, civil society, Indigenous economic development organizations, industry, the financial industry, the procurement industry. I know we're focused on procurement today. So a lot of the work that has been done today in the Indigenous ecosystem really started at a grassroots level. It goes back to that community being built. So there was nothing that was built that was working for Indigenous entrepreneurs. So what do we do as community? We build something that feels true to our values, that acknowledges our lived experience. And so I think this whole notion of this collective now is about really sharing knowledge and ensuring that the ecosystem is being built by Indigenous entrepreneurs and leaders for Indigenous entrepreneurs, so that we can address questions like, what does an Indigenous entrepreneur or innovator need? Who is providing what support? There's, as Shannon was mentioning, there, the ecosystem is really wide. There's a lot of redundancy, and because there's all these little grassroots groups, we don't always know where to go. Entrepreneurs will get bounced around. So who is providing what supports for Indigenous innovators and entrepreneurs? What are the current strengths, gaps, and opportunities that we're seeing in our systems? And how do we strengthen our capacity as an ecosystem, and not just the capacity, but the commitment to this work going forward? So there's this, there's two big questions here, I think, that you've asked me. And when I think about what does the Indigenous entrepreneurship ecosystem look like, I think we're in this time of we're collecting our shared knowledge. We're we've got more stories than ever of Indigenous entrepreneurs who are starting to succeed, not just in their local communities, not just in Canada, but around the world. And we've got some great examples that I can share later. But for founders, it can be really confusing, Indigenous entrepreneurs, where to go for help, because there are so many. But also, when you're starting out, you don't even know what you don't know. And again, that's the importance of really building a strong ecosystem. But I would say for Indigenous entrepreneurs, one, we need to start helping entrepreneurs self-declare, so that we have the data, so that we know where to find our Indigenous entrepreneurs across the country. And looking at the role, like I think I work a lot with NACA and Magnolia and the team over at NACA on the Indigenous women's entrepreneurship, because their Indigenous women are starting at businesses, for example, at twice the rate of Canadian women generally. So giving them, knowing where they can go, there's organizations like the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, who has done a lot of work to map out that ecosystem. And then finally learning too about, asking questions about how do I grow my business? And it's starting to know with the questions, but a lot of this to me does not sit on the shoulders of the entrepreneurs, but of the ecosystem, to start helping to know where we want to take these entrepreneurs in the future. So kind of a big question. I'm not sure that I addressed the what do founders do, but I still think it's on us as an ecosystem to carry that conversation forward.